Antiquity Unveiled. The most marvelous revelations of the 19th century concerning the origin of Christianity. Jonathan M. Roberts. So we arrive at talking about the Nazarene, Apollonius. Apollonius of Tyana, the Jesus of Nazareth, St. Paul, and John the Revelator of the Christian Scriptures. While St. Paul is more of a historical figure, St. Paul was sort of the original inventor of Christianity, one can see. Returns to the earth as a spirit and explains the mysteries that have concealed the theological deception of the Christian hierarchy. Before entering upon this all-absorbing subject, it is simply proper, by way of explanation, to inform the reader that previous to the date given below, Mr. Roberts had been having regular weekly sittings with the medium through whom these communications were received. But in reference to the sitting on May 25th, 1881, Mr. Roberts records in his notes the following: having been informed who would next manifest through the medium, the time having arrived, I felt a thrill of astonishment and delight of the greatest intensity, and the very air of the humble apartment in which we sat seemed filled with the mighty spiritual power, as the name of Apollonius of Tyana was announced, and that we were greeted for the first time by the great Cappadocian sage and philosopher, as well as the great teacher and benefactor that ever drew to himself the love, admiration, and reverence of the civilized world. Apollonius, the spirit-anointed Christ of the Orient. His communication was as follows. So is this whole thing the words of a medium? And we can look at this and compare it to actual historic claims. Because what it's saying about Paul is a little bit off. Let our salutations be the survival of truth and its conquest of superstition. I was born, according to the Christian calendar, on the 16th day of February, the second year of the Common Era, of wealthy parents, was educated until my 26th year in general philosophy and literature, when I served for 6 years under Eucnus of Heraclea, learning the Pythagorean philosophy. After acquiring all I could learn from the teachings of that philosopher, I went to Antioch, and from there to Jerusalem. On account of some wonderful physical manifestations of spirit power taking place through my then young mediumship, which persons living in Jerusalem heard of, my entrance to the city was hailed, as it has been alleged the entrance of Jesus of Nazareth was hailed, with hosannas and songs of praise to one who came in the name of the Lord. And now, mark particularly what I say. This took place when I was 33 years of age. I want you to pay the closest attention to what I shall here set forth. You will, by examining Josephus's work, War of the Jews, see that concerning the siege of Jerusalem a certain prophecy was given, our words were spoken, as is alleged by Jesus of Nazareth, which were fulfilled. You will find what I refer to in Matthew 23rd chapter and 35th verse, where the so-called Jesus is made to have asserted that the generation were guilty of all the blood that had been shed from Abel to Zacharias, the son of Barak, slain between the temple and the altar exactly 34 years after the alleged death of Jesus. And you will find this prophecy then fulfilled, while Jesus is made to have said that it was fulfilled in his time. And here you will have an example of the unauthenticity of the Christian Gospels. All this I learned at the very time which Flavius Josephus wrote the history of the War of the Jews, where I was employed and used by the Emperor Vespasian as his oracle, when in the same state as this medium is, who now sits before you. So Apollonius is definitely one of those characters that that is one of the four historical individuals that became part of Jesus. Sometimes it's and even a at the end. But we look at that and we say, just like many mediums, they're known in various things, and they get themselves in a trap. Maybe they say a little more than they usually do, but true mediumship in that way is not a research thing that you can explain everything by research. But phony mediums, oh, well, I've read a few books here, and I've, so you don't want it to be a book in your home if you're going to fake this, but come on here. Never during my mortal life did I desire to be worshipped after death. Never did I, as a mortal man, teach such a doctrine, but I was deified after my death. 9 epistles are made a present to me by Phraates of Taxila, India. Okay, I'm not sure all which languages are trying to be said. So, Phraates of Taxila, India, or rather between Babylon and India, who was a satrap in those days. Those epistles contain all that is embraced in the present epistles claimed to have been written by St. Paul. And from what I have learned as a spirit, I conclude that I am both the Jesus and St. Paul of the Christian Scriptures. Flattering enough is my vanity, but the ruin of my happiness. It is my duty here to confess all I can bring to recollection, in order that spiritual darkness may disperse and the light of truth shine in. I think there is some reference to early Christianity before the Catholic Church, other than like the couple decades. Around 150, you did have the canonical Gospels all written down in their first versions, and a decade later, you had the compilation of the, you had the decision made which books were going to be made into the Bible. The next, around then, you had, maybe a decade later, you had the Didache, not a century prior like the Catholic Church pretends, but you had the Didache, and then in 180 you had the historical founding of the Catholic Church. But there's some reference to Christianity early on, and if Paul used teachings of Apollonius of Tyana, then it makes sense. It doesn't have to be a separate figure. So there's more information nowadays that kind of... There is one thing that I desire particularly to speak of, and that is the ultimate spirit power on earth. All materialists claims that it is impossible to restore that which is dead to life. Upon this point, upon my own knowledge, I assert that if you have developed your mortal body to that extent, not into what is called moral purity, but into a holy, trusting love, with a heart that beats for humanity, such a person can come in contact with a fresh, young body from which the spirit has been driven out before it could accomplish its mission. Take that body by the hand and with mighty will arrest that spirit. He can force it back to the body, at once inhabited, and make it fulfill its mission. 3 things are necessary to do this. First, a perfectly healthy organism. That does not imply a strong, powerful one. It means that an organism in which the spirit is greater than the body. The excess of spirit producing this result. Here the controlling spirit caused the form of the medium to rise, and extending his arms at full length to the right and left, said, "The spirit addressing you is not confined to the limits of the form you see before you. It not only fills the physical organism as you see, but extends far around it as well. In the time when I lived, in the mortal form, the old was dying out, and the new being born. This was, I mean, that superstition, gods, and all such ideas were on the wane, and man was seeking, as he is today, for something more practical and beneficial." And that is something that soothsayers do, is they complement the movement that they're a part of. It was not through any qualities that I possessed different form, or superior to those of any other man, that I accomplished what I did, but through the spiritual power within and with me. This fact I want to have especially marked. The highest sensitive mortals living in any age or generation, and who were living the nearest in accord with nature's divine law of truth, will bring forth a child who may be the so-called savior of that generation. Those men and women who utter the highest and most beneficial truths to the fellow mortals are the saviors of their time. Further, I have this to say: I retired voluntarily, for I was neither ostracized nor banished for anything I had done, said, or written, to the same island to which is, as alleged, the St. John of Revelations went. In the years 69 to 70, I wrote of what occurred through me in a trance state, not knowing what I wrote. An almost identical story with that attributed to the so-called St. John the Revelator. That story was nothing more than an attempt of the spirit world to give the truth of the spirit life through a mortal organism in a day and generation that was not ripe to receive it. That is, the medium chosen for the expression of the teachings of spirits was too much imbued with the mysticism of Judea and neighboring countries to be well suited for that purpose. Now, with all this medium baloney, can't they just quote? Wouldn't it have been better just to quote a few books? And arrange an interpretation of history? It kind of kicks down the whole thing. What is known to you moderns as the Ante-Nicene Library contained documents, some of which are still extant, that fully warrant you in challenging the translators of today as to the correctness of the production. Let them examine, if they dare, the manuscripts referred to, and they will find what is now being published erroneous in many particulars. They have followed too much what their ancestors translated without having translated for themselves. There are 10,000 variants for Biblia, the Greek part of the Bible. It's not just dialects or anything like this. This is, you have whole chapter. You have not only verses but whole chapters added sometimes to the material. Stuff taken away. Which variant are we supposed to follow? And then there's this phony translating. There's stuff in the tonic and in that section that are, they're not. It's not really translated. They put forward like a so-called interpretation that doesn't amount to things. It's like God is love. It never says that in the Greek. God is loving. If God was love, then the love of evil and ignorance would be God. Now and here, I declare that the Christian Gospels were all preached by me. Preached at Jerusalem, preached at Ephesus, preached at Athens, preached at Philippi, preached at Rome, preached at Antioch, preached at Alexandria, preached at Babylon. In all those countries I preached. And by manipulations and certain qualities developed in me, I healed the sick, restored the sight of the blind, and in the way herein set forth, even raised the dead. I'll try to make this rising of the dead plainer. If a child, a youth, or a maiden, whose body is fresh, full of vigor and perfection, and whose spirit has become detached from it, in that case, I hold that one whose power is great and whose will is indomitable, while that body is yet warm, can cause the spirit to return and continue to inhabit the organism. In this way, I know that the dead can be restored to life. When I lived on earth, all philosophers who taught men to expect redemption, according to more ancient authorities, taught that such redemption was to happen at that time. From what I have been able to learn as a spirit, I was the person who was designed by spirits to fulfill that mission. I claim no preeminence over anyone. I only say that my mortal body contained more spirit than the average of men, or even the most highly developed among them, at the time I existed in my mortal flesh. Well, certainly, this body here, that sits before you, that's the vehicle. And I would hope that my spiritual side is greater than my physical side, regardless of any ability that my physical side may have. My history, as it has come down to you moderns, written by one Damas and others afterwards in regard to the main incidences of my life, is correct. But with regard to the glamour, romance, and mystery of the narrative, it has no relation to me whatever. The latter is the work of my disciples and followers after my death, and it was promulgated by them. Countless figures, exaggerations after they died. One thing more. I am through with my communication. It is this. Almost every picture that is in modern times is recognized as the likeness of Jesus. It's the identical portrait of Apollonius of Tyana, painted in the reign of Vespasian. That emperor consulted me. I was the oracle in his camp. I was the means of saving the life of Flavius Josephus. We here asked him how it came that Josephus had made no mention of that fact in his Jewish war. He replied, the Jewish hierarchy of that day had a horror and a dislike of even their best friends who were not of their flesh, and Josephus, being a Pharisee of the straightest sect, was even more than usually prejudiced against a Gentile like myself. Now, see, this is the thing. No one with self-respect would have called themselves a Gentile. You know what Gentile means? And what the Jews mean by Gentile, Goyim. Calling somebody Goyim because they're of a different tribe. That's absolutely, blood and soil, blood and soil. You might as well go about chanting that like the Nazis, because that's what you mean. Your ancestry's nothing. Look at the book of Isaiah. Regret and repent and you'll be my people. 200 verses that refute this blood and soil Zionism. Even Jerusalem itself doesn't have to be part of Zion, but accusing people of turning their backs on God. Oh, you're of a different birth and a different sect than I am. No, nonsense. Gentile means inferior. It doesn't mean, a common, it's worse than saying a commoner or anything like that. By this, I do not mean that Pharisees were bad people, but that they were so devoted to their religion as to be bitterly bigoted and prejudiced against those who drifted from them, those who differed from them. It is my opinion, from all I can learn as a spirit, and that the Christian Gospels are borrowed from, in the fact that their origin was the books that I brought from India, obtained in part from Phraates, who was king of Taxila. I think of those books that were used by the Platonists, Eclectics, and Gnostics of Alexandria about 150 years after. I died in the year 99 at Ephesus, and was 97 or 98 years of age, although some have enlarged the portion of my earthly life to 150 years. The originals of the 4 Gospels I obtained through one Hiram Irmandi of Taxila, who took me forward into further India. They were written in characters not unlike those used by the Chinese, on thin, tough paper. They treated of the 4 stages of the life of Buddha. The first, to his incarnation and birth. The second, to his childhood and youth. The third, to his mature life. And the fourth, to his old age and death. These books I attained at Singapore, at the extreme point of India, on the strait between India and Sumatra. We here mention to him the fact that 1 week before we had received a communication from a spirit purporting to be Ulfilas, the Christian bishop of the Goths, who said he had translated from Samaritan manuscripts the epistles and the Gospels to which he, Apollonius, had referred to in the Gothic tongue, and that the manuscripts that he had translated were the writings of himself after the originals he obtained at Singapore, India, to which he replied, one Hegesippus made copies for my translation and modified versions of the original in the Samaritan tongue, and Ulfilas copied from the manuscripts of Hegesippus I wrote in my Hebraic Samaritan tongue, which was the language of my country. Now, there is jinn acting, shayateen min al jinn, acting as shades of the dead. But the idea that they would just, they who've been around would just pick up the same claims that the human beings may not be right about. The Gospel of John was written about Bacchus 4 centuries prior, and people knew about that, and that's historically established. It's historically established that by the death of Apollonius, as listed here, we had the writings of Paul pretty much all well established as documents. Now, do we have the originals of this man of the city? No, but it's fair enough, to assume they're pretty early here. But the Gospel of John was written by this time, not the next century. Of course, it was smaller, 19 chapters, and it's like 95% the same. Look, if you compare the two, it's like no, it's not Bacchus this time, it's Jesus. Jesus, Here the control of the medium became wholly exhausted. Bidding us a hasty and most benign adieu, he left the medium more exhausted than we had ever seen him at any previous sitting. No other control of the medium was possible, and thus ended a spirit interview, which is destined to mark an era in human progress never transcended, if ever equaled, in the importance and interest to all classes of human race. We publish such facts as are concealed by ample authority to be historically established concerning Apollonius. There is much that it would be desirable to add as the result of our own researches, but we will confine ourselves mainly to the current history of his life and labors, as the best condensed sketch of the life of Apollonius that we have been able to find. We have chosen that of Penny Cyclopaedia, London, 1834. Oh, the Penny Encyclopedia, yeah. Penny Cyclopaedia, yeah. We feel that we may safely assume as true and proven the following historical statements concerning Apollonius. He was born of wealthy parents at Tyana in Cappadocia, at the very period when it is alleged that the Christian's Jesus was born at Bethlehem. At the age of 12 years, he was sent to Tarsus in Cilicia, the alleged birthplace and home of St. Paul. Not liking the frivolous habits of the people of that city, with his father's consent, he retired to Aga, a town a short distance from Tarsus, where he remained until after attaining to a man's estate. Tarsu equals 666, by the way. Well, Tarshu. Yeah. There he studied every system of philosophy and perfected himself in rhetoric and general literature. There he took up his residence in the temple of Asclepius, so famed for its miraculous cures, was initiated by the priest of that temple in their mysteries, and performed cures that astonished not only the people, but even those masters of the art of healing. He there finally decided to adopt the philosophy of Pythagoras, and vigorously observed the trying discipline instituted by the Samian sage. He performed the terrible task of 5 years' silence, which he endured cheerfully and without a murmur of complaint. He abstained from animal food, wine, and women, lived upon fruits and herbs, dressed only in linen garments of the plainest construction. He went barefooted and with uncovered head, and wore his hair and beard uncut. He was especially distinguished for his beauty, his general bearing, his uniform love and kindness, and his imperturbable equanimity of temper. In these respects, he was the personal embodiment of the imaginary traits of the Christian Jesus, and it was no doubt the original of the pictures of the so-called Nazarene, now so venerated by uninformed professors of the Christian religion, determined to devote himself to the pursuit of knowledge and the teachings of philosophy. He gave away his large patrimony to his poor relatives and went to Antioch, then a center of learning, but little less noted than Athens or Alexandria. There he began his great mission by teaching philosophy to a number of disciples and to the people. He entered the temple of Apollo Daphne at Antioch and learned the mysteries of its priesthood. Philostratus describes the style of speaking adopted by Apollonius thus: Apollonius used a style of speaking not elevated, nor swollen in the language of poetry, nor yet one too refined, nor too Attic, for whatever exceeded the Attic mediocrity was considered by him dissonant and unpleasant. He made use of no fastidious nicety in the division of his discourses, nor any fine-spun sentences, nor was he known to adopt an ironical manner, nor any kind of apostrophizing with his hearers. He spoke, as it were, from a tripod, to wit, I know, and it seems to me, and to what purpose is this? And you must know, his sentences were short and adamantine, his words authoritative and adapted to the sense, and the bare utterances of them conveyed a sound as if they were sanctioned by the scepter of royalty. Being asked once by a sceptral disputant why he did not propose what side of a question he should take in argument, he replied, when I was a young man, I used to follow that practice, but that is no longer necessary, as it's now become my duty not to investigate, but to teach the result of my investigations. When he was asked by the same logician how a wise man should speak, he said as the legislator, for it was the part of a legislator to command the multitude to do what he himself was convinced ought to be done. In this way he conducted himself at Antioch, and converted many who were strangers to his knowledge. Now when it is remembered that the description of the style in which Apollonius spoke is written by Namius, the friend, pupil, and companion of the Cappadocian sage, long before Jesus Christ, of the Christian scriptures were heard or thought of,